So we've had several panel sessions today, and we'll swiftly go over to the next panel session that we'll be having. And it's basically on a regulatory framework for fostering digital infrastructure development in Africa. I'm going to take that again. Regulatory framework for fostering digital infrastructure development in Africa. I'll start by calling on the moderator of this panel session, Sade Dada. She is a public policy manager, Anglophone West Africa Meta Platform. Please, a round of applause. A round of applause as she comes to the stage. Thank you very much. I also have on the list Dr. Ayotunde Coker, who is seated right here. Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Tony Izuagbe. He's the president, He's the President, Association of Telecommunications Companies of Nigeria. I'm sorry if I murdered your name. Izuagbe. All right, please a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next panelist today is Chukwuemeka Fred. He is the Chief Executive Officer, Anambra State ICT Agency. Please, a round of applause as he comes on stage. Thank you very much. Finally, we also have on the list the Honorable Commissioner of Science, Technology, and Innovation, Lagos State. I'm talking about no other person but Olatubosun Alake. Please, a round of applause as we have the Honorable Commissioner for Science, Technology, and Innovation. And finally on the list is Douglas Njenga, who is the Director, Regulatory Affairs and Special Projects. Ladies and gentlemen, please a round of applause as he comes up on stage. A round of applause. So for the next 30 minutes, we'll be having insightful conversation, and it's basically on a regulatory framework for fostering digital infrastructure development in Africa. I'm going to hand over to Sade. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a great morning and afternoon. As you can understand throughout the program, regulation has been a theme that's come up in every single panel. We'll dive a little bit more into it through this panel. Dr. Coker did a really great job of going through where things are right now in Africa, some of the frameworks that exist, and what the issue is that regulation should be able to help resolve. I'll just give a very brief opportunity for the panelists to introduce themselves so that you understand where they're coming from with their contributions to the session today. So I'll just start with Douglas, who's online. Douglas, are you there?
I hope you can hear me.
Okay, while we wait for the media team to help us, I'll move on to allow, we'll have President of ATCON, Mr. Tony, to please introduce himself and let us know a little bit about why this subject is dear to him.
I think you dodged my surname there.
I actually intentionally am doing first names.
Okay, cool.
I may have to make an exception for Honorable Commissioner.
My names, I'm a very African person. My names are Tony Izuagbe Emoekpere. I'm the president of ATCON, that's the Association of Telecom Companies of Nigeria. And as the name suggests, almost everybody who's been discussing here are our members. And one of our primary assignments as an association is advocacy. And we do a lot of advocacy on behalf of our members here seated and represented in the audience regarding some of these issues they have with exactly the topic we are discussing right now, regulatory framework, regulation, and things like that. So it's an honor and a privilege to be on this committee to discuss these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to call on Honorable Commissioner Olatubosun Alake.
Thank you very much. You can call me Tubosun or Bosun for short. Thanks for having me. I'm the Commissioner for Innovation, Science and Technology. And basically my portfolio entails driving out digital infrastructure for government, and also most especially driving innovation statewide. And innovation, as you well know, has a pipeline all the way from ideation, research and development to commercialization. And so while my day-to-day, I serve the government in a lot of its digital implementations statewide, we also try to raise the level of innovation in Lagos State, double the amount of innovation outputs from all the various stakeholders. Thank you.
Sorry, Sade. Just a quick information. We would have Director Regulatory Affairs and Special Projects, Douglas Njenga, who would be joining us virtually. Sade, just to let you know. He's joining us virtually and is up on the link right now.
Yes, we saw him earlier and I called on him. Is he back on? Okay. Douglas, can you hear us? Okay. Mr. Douglas, can you please introduce yourself?
I can hear you, but I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. My name is Douglas Njenga. I support the WIOCC Group in matters regulatory special projects. In my time, I've participated in a lot of the international cables coming into Africa. I was there from the onset of the build of the True Africa cable that's coming on to go live in the West and the East, and our story continues in building infrastructure across Africa, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Douglas. I'll next go to Mr. Chukwuemeka Fred Agbata, also affectionately called CFA.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Just keep it as CFA. Great to be here. My role at the moment is having served the ecosystem for a couple of years. I'm currently now working as the CEO of the Anambra State ICT Agency. Anambra State chose a unique position, which is to collapse the Ministry of Science and Technology and chose to make it an agency backed by law. And so it's an agency which pretty much makes it smaller, nimble, and just more targeted. And so our role includes deepening e-governance for the state, the government, and the people, as well as deepening, building infrastructure, deepening technology in general, and also helping to build the public servants. Because at the end of the day, when you build out all this infrastructure, if the civil servants and the public servants are not aligned, that's where you have the sustainability gap. So yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And lastly, to introduce himself yet again in the context of this discussion, I'll turn it to Dr. Ayotunde Coker.
Yeah, thanks. What I'd add to the previous a couple of introductions as CEO of Open Access Data Centers, I'm responsible for the business across Africa. And our flagship is here in Lagos. We have 4 key data centers in South Africa, Durban, where 2 Africa lands, Joburg, 2 in Cape Town, 1 where Equiano lands as well. The one in Lagos here is where the Equiano cable lands into Lagos over here. But significantly, OADC is owned by a company called WIOCC. So Douglas is my colleague at WIOCC Group. I'm part of the WIOCC leadership executive team at group level. WIOCC is a connectivity company across Africa. It's expanded into data centers. So the group company has open access, wholesale, hyperscale connectivity, and open access carrier neutral data centers and building out right across Africa.
Thank you very much. I think it's helpful to know where our panelists sit and why this conversation is relevant for them. We stand to learn quite a bit. So I'd like to jump right in and turn to Douglas online for the first question, which is, if you could just take a few minutes to describe the current regulatory landscape over connectivity and infrastructure in Africa. What do you see as some of the countries that are doing very well, and what are the reasons for that? Walk us through.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I'll start with just a short context, right? 98% of the internet as we know it today goes through submarine cables. We have a joke in the industry that the cloud is actually deep under the ocean, and that gives a perspective of what exactly we are looking to regulate and or protect in today's age. Dr. Ayotunde has provided a very good context on the continent in terms of where we are as a continent. Out of 54 countries, you're looking at 16 countries being landlocked. So that 98% of connectivity would rely on countries with submarine cables. And therefore, there's a big difference in terms of the adoption of regulatory frameworks. The pioneers, and to give credit where it's due, the countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and in the same vein, I think some of the leadership on the continent has come from Nigeria. The Honorable Minister issued a flagship policy in Nigeria, for instance, that considers subsea cables and telecoms infrastructure as critical infrastructure. So there are countries that are really leading in the forefront, up to and including South Africa. But then there are still countries that, from a regulatory point of view, are still way behind. If you look at countries like Mali and Chad and Central African Republic, those are countries that still are very far off in terms of even understanding what types of regulation to put in place, where to start and where to go. And in terms of the 5 sort of key focus areas, in the interest of time, when we look at regulation, we're looking at matters around data protection and privacy, licensing and permitting, spectrum management, tax and investment incentives for the telecom industry, and terrestrial and subsea cable laws. So if you actually focus on those 5 key areas, there's still a lot that the continent needs to do. I'm optimistic that in this panel we've got enough opinion leaders to discuss it. There's still a lot more that we can look at in terms of where we are and where we could be. I had the pleasure of speaking at the ICPC this year, and the big agenda in a country like Singapore was congestion of submarine cables. And one of the highlights of the minister in Singapore was that if a submarine cable is landing in Singapore, she only needs 1 week to get all the permits, right? In Africa, if you're looking to do a significantly similar project, you need to start the permitting process a minimum of 2 to 3 years in advance. What can we learn from that? Are there things we can still do to improve those types of key areas in terms of regulation and how we provide support to Africa's digital backbone? So I'll stop there maybe, and we can talk a lot more as we go.
Thank you so much. I think it's critical that you mentioned sometimes the lead time that you need for projects as a result of the regulatory landscape. Dr. Coker, you're very familiar with what goes into making investment decisions. Can you give us some insights into what kind of regulatory intervention would be necessary to increase investment in digital infrastructure?
Yeah, one, collectively as Africa, we have to work on our optics. And it's a collective thing. So I think players in the digital infrastructure world, we've been doing all we can, show up and tell Africa's story, talk about the potential of Africa, talk about the demographics of Africa, talk about improving governance, improving ease of doing business, show the trajectory is going in the right way, and all of that stuff. And you then start to see investors picking up on those things. And what's happened over the last 5 years is significantly different to what is happening now. Africa has become a lot more attractive as an investment destination. Talk to the DFIs, and they see that as sort of Africa, right? But it's one thing telling the story about Africa. It's a bit like even telling the story of Nigeria and think you can, Maiduguri and Borno State and same as Lagos State. There's, as much as everything is so similar, is as much as everything is different. Yeah, and I find the charm of Africa always consistent everywhere you go to, but you need to know the idiosyncrasies of where you are. And therefore, we also need investors to understand that there are 54 countries in Africa, but there's a benefit of the whole, right? With that, and I think we saw earlier on that the IFC was talking about the returns to be had, but you've got to play the long game. And we've got to tell the right stories to investors that are coming to Africa as a whole. So as regulators also across the continent need to recognize that they've got to play a role in attracting investment into the industries they regulate. So the style of regulation, the body language that's given out there, the sort of regulatory frameworks that are put in place, and so on, have to be such that investors see it as investor friendly. It has to be consistent over time, and and it also has to have the confidence to do the right thing and do things right, and not be browbeaten just for the sake of it. And you see, when you do the right things, do things right, it's very difficult to get browbeaten, especially when we have the right caliber of people driving the regulatory agenda, And in my view, that's what we need to do. It's difficult to say we have a Pan-Africa regulator because there's so many things that are different in different ways. What I saw as a possible Pan-Africa framework was what's been emerging around data protection, because that kind of underpins so many things, right? Nevertheless, we need to have bodies like Smart Africa, really, and they've been doing a lot. Nigeria is now part of Smart Africa. That was one of the things I saw as an exception. Very much as I do as ADCA to be African, sometimes I stick inside Nigeria and say, hang on, right, what's going on here, okay? And so it's great to see Nigeria as part of that Smart Africa, because they drive the awareness and the cohesion of so many things that we do that's right for Africa. And it's the kind of thing that investors will see as some sort of body that has so many countries. I can't remember how many countries now, but they've done a good job in getting at presidential level across all of the countries participation and representation across Africa. They can actually give the right view, and the CEO does a great job of showing up for Africa, in my view, when I interact with him internationally, to create the right optics and engage with investors. That it's not necessarily easy. Good things are not always easy. You need to play the long game. You may have short-term headwinds, just as you need to figure out how to understand South America, as you need to understand Asia, as you need to understand the investment climate that's different between Germany and Italy and the UK. It's just in exactly the same way you need to think about putting the effort in to understand the investment environment you're looking at as Africa, and think about it as 54 countries. But it helps when we've had the bodies like Smart Africa, they've done the work ahead to create the right optics to encourage investors to actually put a lot more in. But you do have investors that have presence across different countries in Africa, Francophone, Anglophone, they understand all of that stuff, international ones, and they figure out the ways to make their investment work effectively. And also companies, countries and regulatory sort of regions on the continent have to recognize the fact that if you're going to have international investors, there are some international aspects of etiquette and style that you need to abide by, while not forgetting that we're African.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you so much. I think one key point from your remarks is that consistency, that encourages investment, and having that consistency across multiple countries helps these in companies that are investing make long-term decisions. So, Mr. Izuagbe, you have the unique position of seeing some of the different ecosystem players in digital infrastructure and how they plug into investing and in improving connectivity. What are some of the best practices, regulatory best practice that you see would be necessary? Maybe some that you've already seen that have gone well, and some that you would like to see.
Well, thank you. From the regulatory policy standpoint, I think we've always been saying it that most of the time it's not regulation that is the issue, but there's the practicalization of the regulation that has always been the problem. Some best practices, especially when we're looking at hyperscalers, who are, what are their main infrastructure? We're talking about the asset itself, the data center itself, power, which came up so much during this conference. We're talking about fiber optic network, both terrestrial and subsea. So what practices will encourage that? Things, for example, like harmonizing regulations across, regions, for example, whereby I know even the regulatory bodies in West Africa, they have a body, okay? They should be able to harmonize some of the regulations across, because don't forget, one of the key things for hyperscalers is providing capacity almost in each and every country. And it will be a big taller that if you're having to renegotiate different kinds of regulations across the region, when, for example, a subsea cable is going from the top of West Africa down to the bottom of West Africa, and you're all related. So that would be a good way to start. Some of the other policies that should be there, they're already there. For example, infrastructure sharing, it's almost universal. It's not being debated now. The elephants in the room, as usual, right-of-way issues. By and large, it's being simplified. It's supposed to be simplified to a point where an investor can, on the back of an investment portfolio, understand the fees that's supposed to play. And I think that is there. I think some of the other things that need to be put in place are things like incentives. Okay, we're looking at now the bulk of the data centers are actually at where the submarine cables land. So there must be an incentive for any data center provider or hyperscaler to move his investment upland, for example. What incentives? There should be incentives for that. Things like PPP was mentioned several times in this conference. Sort of policies that should be put in place. For example, I've had this discussion severally. I know it's a big of a challenge, but there's no reason why all government data, for example, must be domiciled locally, just as a policy. Just as a policy to encourage the industry. So those are policies that can be put in place. And then we discussed so much about power issues. If I'm going to invest in green energy, for example, what is the incentive? So those kind of policies would drive, and I think those are the areas we need to look at. The thing is that from engagement we've had as an association with government, one of the things I've seen as a big gap, and I encourage all of us as industry players, is that we are sadly armchair managers. we sit down in the office and we don't engage government. And we expect these things to happen by magic. No, we have to engage. We have to sit down with the regulators. They have to understand our problems. Because if the industry doesn't thrive, okay, there are certain KPIs they also have that they can't meet. So the issue is engagement. I think that's the issue, because some of these things we are mentioning here, okay, we have to be able to table it before them, before they understand that these are the things that would drive that kind of investment. And I think as an association, we've been trying to do that on behalf of our members. And I think the more support we get and the more events like this we have, whereby we engage. And the good thing, I'm happy to be on the panel here with two state commissioners. So the engagement is already in full swing, so to speak. And I think the more we engage, the understanding will be there that these are the kind of best practices that are obtainable everywhere. For example, in East Africa, they had a roaming agreement, okay, that was pushed, whereby all traffic within there are no roaming charges, okay, and that was done by the East African bodies. Okay, they came together and said, okay, fine, if you are roaming across East Africa, we eliminate roaming charges for you, and that stimulates. There's no investor that will see that kind of thing. And then we're always asking, how come a lot of things go to East Africa, Kenya, and things like that? These are the kind of policies and frameworks, best practices that they need to be put in place to stimulate the industry.
Thank you so much. That engagement is key. And speaking of roaming agreements, just as we were sitting here today, I saw the news that Sierra Leone and Guinea were signing an MOU, and it included things like cybersecurity and roaming and a fiber optic cable between them. So that collaboration is very important. So I'd like to go over to Mr. CFA to talk about public-private partnerships and what you've seen in Anambra that can be useful to the different states that are represented here and also different countries when it comes to working with the private sector and government together.
Well, thank you very much. So, I mean, in my own case, I was in the industry. And so when this role came on board, it was easy for me to connect with senior colleagues and friends. And part of what we sought to do was, how do we leverage some of this relationship to go into very formidable partnerships? Because at the end of the day, government is overburdened. Well, government doesn't have all the money to solve all the problems. The money, like Doc said, is in the private capital, right? The private sector, it's got the money. So one of the things that we did in the States was we followed states like Lagos or Kaduna as a den that were the forerunners in making right of way completely free of charge. Because we found out that, okay, being in the industry, I knew that was a major challenge. There was this right of way issue where states charge the infracos or the telcos or whoever that is providing the infrastructure. And so we sort of, made an appeal to the governor of Anambra State, Professor Charles Chukwuemeka Soludo, to waive the right of way following some of the states. And the whole idea was to encourage partnership. And so we started working with the likes of IHS, who wanted to basically connect their towers. I mean, they've been in the state trying to make that happen, and that couldn't happen. So we waived the right of way for IHS to make that happen. But part of the condition we asked for example, we said we wanted to connect all our government facilities, right? So right now, for the first time, the civil servants, prior to that, we had provided some sort of hardware, laptops and hardware facility for the civil servants. And so for the first time now, you have a civil service where people now have access to the internet, right? That's the PPP, for example. We've also seen, basically with that, we gave two providers that opportunity. We've also then seen now, for the first time, some of the things that we enjoy here in Lagos. For the first time, we've seen in the capital city. So Anambra State is sort of unique because it's a 3-city state. And these 3 cities are big in their own rights. Not too many states have that. So you have Oka, which is the state capital. You have Onitsha, which is the commercial nerve center. Then you have Nnewi, which is the manufacturing hub. All of these places are huge in their own right? So, but my point is that right now, you've now started seeing direct-to-home fiber connectivity to homes at the moment, right? And so, for me, and even just one of the reasons why I came to this conference was, looking at how do we even create collaboration and partnerships. I mean, personally, for example, I think the hyperscalers, the states cannot afford the hyperscalers, like the ones we call the hyperscalers. I don't think the states can afford it. And I've said this to my friend, Olatubosun. I say it anywhere, like, you can't even, I mean, I can't even take it to my governor. He will just calculate the number of kilometers of roads and he will say, CFA, just wait, we'll do it later. So what I did when I also got to the States was to look for a local service cloud provider that I've been working with for about 2.5 years. And it's been seamless, right? Yes, there have been challenges. You may say they're not as good as not good. They may not be as, I don't know the word to use, but the point is that for the state, where the state is, I mean, the state is not a bank. The state is a state. For where the state is and for its infrastructure, that local company has done a bit of a good job, right? So what I like to preach, how do we protect and support as much as possible our local industry? It's very critical because at the end of the day, I mean, the perfect example, I have a few of the Starlink dishes, but when I sit where I sit and I see a Starlink that probably has, I don't know how many, president, do they have up to 10 employees or maybe 20 employees? I don't know how many employees they have. And I see a TZT that has 300. I mean, if I have my way, I'll protect the TZT more, but I'm a sub-national. There's a limit that I can do. But my point is, I try and I make it the point of duty, as long as my governor supports me, that any local operator that comes to my state, Anambra State, we will try as much as possible to give them the support that they need, because I know that's how we can retain jobs here. It's not rocket science. If you export jobs, you lose jobs. So you've got to find the balance. And so that's why I would say that for me, I really prioritize local public-private partnership. I will use that phrase. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and it's helpful to see that the examples from Anambra, concrete examples. Thank you for walking us through that. For our last question, last but not least, Honorable told us to call him Tubosun. In your experience, how have you been able to balance the needs of the state in securing the public, thinking about what is necessary to protect the public, protect investment, but also promote innovation, promote connectivity, investment in the state? How do you see that balance? What are the things that you have to implement to strike the right balance?
Well, I think first and foremost is massive consultation with the stakeholders to identify some of the risks that are involved, whether it's in deployment or physical infrastructure or digital infrastructure. If you look at CBN, for instance, right? CBN's main role is to protect the financial system. And so something that they do not understand, it's always defensive first, right? The only way you can overcome that for them is, number one, massive consultation and engagement with them. Number two, I think, is test beds, sandboxes, right? Because if you are able to help them see in a limited environment what the results, right, of any implementation could be, then they are able to say, okay, fine, we see these results in a limited fashion, then that can help us draft some kind of initial policy paper, right? And I also think there needs to be a lot of advocacy. I love what Mr. Ayotunde Coker said about, private sector participants developing their own code of conduct it saves the government a lot of wahala because, you know, if they have a policy paper that police themselves, it saves me a lot of money. I don't need to really start browbeating anybody because, you know, you have that code of conduct, they police themselves, they sanction themselves. That's all well and good. And I think one other thing that I needed to add an addendum to is the consultation part. I think a lot of the industry also needs to interact with state legislatures, right? I think that's a huge missing opportunity. The big regulator is in Abuja, yes, but if we understand the kind of federating entity that Nigeria is, each state actually is a country on its own that has its own unique goals and aspirations, its own unique environment, right? There are some policies that might work in Nasarawa that might not work for Lagos. So it's not always necessarily a one-size-fits-all. How do you understand the nuances, right? It's by engaging these state legislatures so that they too understand what's at stake, and so they can also make common sense policies. I think that's it.
Thank you. I think it's important that you talked about engagement, which we had heard earlier in the conversation, but not just with the typical stakeholders. So it was a really good point to talk about the state legislature, which I think has been missing from a lot of this discussion, and the impact or the role that they play on the state and local level.
So, sorry, can I just add something? You know, one other thing that I think I wanted to add is government reform, right? It's really, really major. The MD and I were talking, and we were talking about, and even Mr. Izuagbe, yeah.
Tony.
Yes. Mr. Tony. Ease of doing business is a huge thing. Ease of doing business is a huge thing in Nigeria. In fact, it's the difference between whether a business decides that they are going to invest or not. However, the ease of doing business, who ultimately implements it, right? The responsible custodian for implementing the ease of doing business rules ultimately are the state legislatures, right? Because you can imagine, you know the example like in the US where Congress calls maybe cabinet members to come and give account as to the level of implementation of this particular rule, right? And so the state legislatures are very, very important. Civil servants are also very important. There needs to be a level of reform if ease of doing business is going to go up. And I'm going to give a typical example. If, for instance, a director in the civil service, right, needs to sign off an infrastructure investment, maybe it's about $100 million, and this same director in the civil service only makes 150,000 naira a month, you are going to have problems.
Yeah.
You are going to have issues because he's the one you need to get to. And he's signing these large checks, but yet he himself, you know, he cannot feed his family adequately. And so we talk about ease of doing business. We don't see the undercurrent that really causes a lot of those things. And how do you drive government reform, right? Making sure that qualified people are in the right places. You pay them according to what they are worth. And then when you pay them according to what they are worth, you can demand the best. You definitely cannot demand the best from somebody making 150,000 naira a month. You cannot. He's not a saint. Neither are we.
This is a very fair point.
That's the fact. And so, why am I saying engage state legislatures? Because they can drive the civil service reforms. right? And even the House of Rep as well. They also need, because that's even where some of these salaries, some of these laws, some of these policies are decided. And so I think Nigerians need to take an active part, active citizenry in driving their representatives to implement some of these common sense policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that activism. I see you're itching, but they have been giving us more time and more time and more time. So we have to wrap up. I'm sorry. So we don't have time for questions, correct? Okay. And so rather than spend the 5 minutes we were supposed to spend to wrap up, I won't do that. What I will do is take the liberty to say that all of us on this panel are accessible. We've been here, some of us, all day. If you have any questions, follow-ups, please feel free to come and talk to us, meet with us, reach out to us online, and we'll be happy to answer questions that you may have. I want to use this opportunity to thank our panelists. Thank you, Doug. We still see you online.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please a round of applause for our amazing panelists and of course our wonderful moderator. Can we have a photo session just quickly? Photo session. Thank you very much.